Admiral Grady, Vice Admiral Grady, Mr. Swartz, flag officers, senior executives, Fleet Master Chief, Mrs. Orr, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good morning and welcome to the Fleet Forces Command commemoration of the 79th anniversary of the Battle of Midway. The invocation will be delivered by Chaplain Hinson.
Please bow your heads in prayer. Eternal Father, we remember before you with grateful hearts the men and women of our country who in the day of decision ventured much for the liberties we now enjoy. We especially remember the 307 Americans who paid the last full measure of devotion during the Battle of Midway to stem the tide of an expanding tyranny. Bless us this day as we sail forth from this our own Point Luck. Grant that we may discover the grit to sustain us when valor is needed. May we have the wisdom to understand the principle of calculated risk and apply it to the creation of freedom, justice, and righteousness all our days. Amen.
Thank you, chaps. Ladies and gentlemen, Admiral Chris Grady, Commander, U.S. Fleet Forces Command.
Well, good morning, and thank you for joining me today here in beautiful POW-MIA Park to celebrate the nation's most significant naval battle and naval victory, a battle that changed the tide of the war in the Pacific and the course of world history during World War II, the Battle of Midway. Chaps, again, thank you for your characteristically insightful thoughts and inspirational words to open this today's ceremony. I also want to thank the Assistant Chief of Staff, Commander Palmerone, and the entire team at the Command Recreation Committee for putting together this, this very fitting commemoration ceremony. And I think it is really important that we do this because I firmly believe in the importance of this moment in our naval history, and so it really is an honor, a true honor for me to be able to participate and share some moments of reflection with you, reflection upon our proud heritage. Now, as many of you have heard me say before, I feel very privileged, and I hope you all too, to serve in the greatest Navy the world has ever known. And it's events like Midway and the heroic actions of so many that should make us feel that way. It was a battle won by what Walter Lord described as a magic blend of skills, faith, and valor, which lifted those who fought from certain defeat to incredible victory. And indeed, Midway was won because of the absolutely incredible fighting spirit of all who contributed that day. Midway was won by the ingenuity of the sailors of Station Hypo, the team of cryptographers who broke the Imperial Japanese JN-25 code. Midway was won by the determination, expertise, and grit displayed by the 1,400 shipyard workers of Pearl Harbor Naval Shipyard who patched up Yorktown in less than 3 days, making her fit enough to fight after sustaining heavy battle damage during the Battle of Coral Sea. Midway was won by the courage, determination, and selfless acts of aviators from Torpedo Squadrons VT-6, VT-8, Task Force 16, and Task Force 17, who launched into relentless barrages of Japanese anti-aircraft fire and Japanese veteran fighters, all to clear the way for our dauntless dive bombers to deliver their deadly payloads. And Midway was won by the brave tin can sailors who stood by their shipmates in the dying Yorktown, going aboard to rescue those who were too wounded to abandon ship and going aboard to continue fighting its raging fires. They did not give up the ship that day, even after being torpedoed by an enemy submarine and protected from capture until the moment she went down with her American flag waving proudly. And so, as is true in every conflict across our entire history, it was our sailors who are rightfully ensconced as the center of the universe. It is those sailors that ensured our victory. And so we take time over the next few days to reflect on the bravery, the tenacity, and the valor of the sailors and Marines who fought fearlessly, and those 307 who made the ultimate sacrifice upon the altar of freedom. We must let their stories guide us as we meet the challenges of the future with our own fighting spirit renewed. Now today, to help us bring to life those amazing stories of heroism, I have the distinct pleasure of introducing an educator and guardian of Navy history and heritage, Mrs. Laura Orr. Mrs. Orr is the Director of Education at the Hampton Roads Naval Museum, and as an accomplished historian, she speaks with authority for those who have come before us. She has focused her career on the preservation and education of military history, working at Fort Monroe's Casement Museum, Stratford Hall up in Northern Virginia, and at the Gettysburg National Military Park in Pennsylvania. Laura, we are fortunate to have such a devoted professional like you preserving our treasured Navy heritage, and we are honored to have you join us here today. Ladies and gentlemen, Mrs. Laura Orr.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Today we're here to commemorate the 79th anniversary of one of the U.S. Navy's greatest victories, the Battle of Midway, fought on June 4th, 5th, and 6th, 1942. This battle involved 26 U.S. ships, 360 planes, and 19 submarines. After the smoke had cleared, American forces counted up the human toll. 307 sailors, Marines, and aviators killed or lost at sea. It was an important engagement, one that shaped the path of the U.S. Navy for the remainder of the 20th century. Significantly, it solidified the importance of the aircraft carrier and the attached carrier air wing, which were, at the time, untested technologies. Additionally, the victory at Midway made possible the American amphibious invasions of 1942 and 1943, the so-called island hopping campaigns. With the Japanese Navy reeling from the defeat, the U.S. Army and Marine Corps took possession of enemy territory without fear of heavy reprisal from the Japanese carrier fleet. In essence, although Midway did not make American victory inevitable, it did set the stage for the westward American offensives, which eventually culminated in the unconditional surrender of the Japanese in 1945. Today we're going to talk about the American naval experience at the battle, telling the story through the eyes of those who experienced it firsthand. My goal today is to memorialize the battle. That is, to tell you about the men who came before you, to talk about the decisions they rendered in June 1942, the emotions they felt, and the sacrifices that they made. It's well enough to say that the Navy has sustained a legacy of honor, service, and glory. But we can't give those words true meaning in our modern times unless we reflect on what those words meant for previous generations of sailors. Let us pause today to consider the ways they risked it all to win the battle, the ways the sailors and aviators pushed themselves to get the job done, and the sobering losses suffered by the squadrons, the crews, and the families who lost loved ones during those 3 fateful days. On this, the 79th anniversary of the battle, I hope that we can take the time to reflect on the lesson that they have imparted to us, that wars are often won through risk, and that risk pays a heavy price. We'll start our narrative this morning with the story of a submarine that played an important role in the battle. After the Japanese began their attack on Midway Island on the morning of June 4th, planes from the Midway garrison attempted to strike back at the Japanese carrier task force called the Kido Butai. During this attack, the American planes scored no hits on the Japanese ships, losing 17 of their 51 planes. But as the Kido Butai dodged these fruitless attacks, a U.S. submarine, one of 12 on patrol west of Midway, arrived on the scene. The submarine was the 12-year-old USS Nautilus. It was skippered by Lieutenant Commander William Brockman, who was then out on his first patrol. Despite being alone on the submarine picket line, Brockman ordered his crew to go to general quarters, submerge the boat, and attack. As Brockman later reported, ships were on all sides of us, moving across the field at high speed and circling away to avoid our submarine's position. A battleship was on our port bow, firing her whole starboard broadside battery, their periscope. He made a bold decision that morning, especially given the fact that his submarine's primary weapon, the Mark 14 torpedo, had been plagued by dysfunction. Although submarine skippers had been complaining to the Bureau of Ordnance for the past 6 months since the war began, no one in high command took their protests seriously. So though he was doubtful of actually damaging any enemy ships, at 8:25 that morning, Brockman ordered 2 torpedoes fired, both of which missed their targets. His assault brought countermeasures from a Japanese destroyer, the Arashi. For the next hour, Nautilus's crew endured a depth charge attack, something that proved entirely new to the crew, particularly the cases of temporary deafness that would prevail in the days following. Now the great question remains, why did Brockman attack? Certainly he hoped that by being an annoyance to the Japanese, he might disrupt their plans. And although he didn't know it at that time, that is exactly what happened. By attacking, he forced the Japanese fleet to detach a destroyer to deal with his submarine. That action, the detachment of a single ship, ended up changing the course of a battle. As it happened later in the day, U.S. dive bombers found that ship, the Arashi, and they followed it back to the Kido Butai, a tactical change that may not have happened had Brockman not put his submarine into harm's way. Now, while the crew of the Nautilus experienced their first taste of battle, planes from the 3 American carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, began their attack on the Japanese task force. Hornet's torpedo squadron attacked first, striking at 9:20 that morning. The Japanese fighters savaged the slow-moving torpedo planes. They shot down all 15 planes and killed 29 of 30 crewmen. 20 minutes later, torpedo planes from Enterprise arrived and a repeat performance occurred. 9 of the 14 planes dropped into the sea in about 10 minutes' time. Finally, torpedo planes from the last carrier, Yorktown, arrived, and 10 of their 12 planes were shot down, with the last 2 crashing on their way back to the fleet. In the space of about 50 minutes, these squadrons lost 37 of 41 planes, 68 of 82 crewmen, and they didn't score a single hit. The reason for this terrible tragedy stemmed from the fact that the TBD Devastators, the torpedo bombers they flew, carried a notoriously defective weapon. Like their brothers in the submarines, the torpedo plane pilots complained that their aerial torpedoes would never detonate, and they shouldn't be flying against the Japanese ships until a new weapon could be manufactured. Repeatedly, their complaints were ignored. So at Midway, the admirals and air group commanders sent them on a mission that stood little chance of success. Many of the torpedo pilots died horrible deaths. Lieutenant Commander Lance Massey of Syracuse, New York, commanded the last of the attacking squadrons, Torpedo Squadron 3 from USS Yorktown. As his squadron approached the Japanese carrier Hiryu, a flurry of fighters pounced on his planes, shooting them down one at a time. Massey's plane was one of the last to fall from the sky. Machine gun fire ripped through his plane's fuel tanks, pouring flame into the cockpit. As the inferno engulfed his stricken aircraft, Massey unhitched his seatbelt and he crawled out onto the wing. Unfortunately, he was too low to deploy his parachute. His rear seat gunner, Chief Leo Perry, unaware of the fuel tank fire, continued firing at enemy planes behind them. Only 3 crewmen from this squadron survived the attack, and all 3 had the gut-wrenching misfortune of watching their skipper's plane crash. One of them, radioman Lloyd Childers, later remembered, I was the rear gunner in the plane on Massey's right wing. The formation was very close. I saw the skipper's plane burst into flames. My pilot, Harry Coral, later told me that Massey stood up in his cockpit. The rear gunner in his plane was my boss, Chief Leo Perry. I could see his facial expressions clearly. First, his face showed questioning, like, what's happening? Second, his expression was fear. Then I watched as their plane hit the water, exploding in a mass of churning fire. Those were the final seconds in the lives of Lieutenant Commander Massey and Chief Perry. The only good part was that it was quick. The fact that the aviators of the torpedo squadrons charged their planes at the enemy, knowing that they stood little chance of survival, is one of the many moments from this battle that is worth remembering. One of the fortunate few to be spared a fiery end was Radioman Third Class Lloyd Childers, a rear seat gunner in Torpedo Squadron 3. Childers, in fact, celebrated his 21st birthday that day on June 4th, 1942. When he jumped into the gunner's seat of his plane that morning, he announced to his pilot, Harry Coral, "Mr. Coral, today is my 21st birthday. Today, I am a man." 2 hours later, his newfound manhood was about to be put to the test. During the attack on the Japanese carrier Hiryu, Coral dropped his torpedo and attempted to return to USS Yorktown. Japanese Zeros chased his plane, peppering the wings and stabilizer with machine gun fire. 2 shots struck Childers in the leg. One shattered his ankle bone, and as Childers remembered, it hurt like hell. Gamely, Childers returned fire, but soon his .30 caliber machine gun turret jammed. Undaunted, he unholstered his .45 caliber pistol and he rested it on the turret's faceplate. He pointed it at a pursuing Zero and fired. Reflecting on this action years later, Childers recalled, "People would ask me, 'Childers, you didn't think you were going to really hit one of them, did you?' 'No, but you have no idea how good it made me feel.'" When Childers' bullet-riddled plane reached Yorktown hours later, pilot Harry Coral found he couldn't land on the deck. Battle damage prevented it by that point. The lone torpedo bomber circled the ship, with Coral unsure of what to do. Down below, Seaman Wayne Childers, Lloyd's brother, recognized the markings on the plane and he knew his brother had returned. So running across the flight deck, he waved frantically, hoping that Lloyd would respond. Too weak from the loss of blood, Childers could barely lift his arm. His pilot informed him that they'd have to ditch their plane and swim for it, a prospect that did not appeal to the wounded gunner. In the end, the plane splashed into the water, and the 2 aviators boarded a life raft to await rescue. Their squadron had lost 21 of 24 men. They were 2 of only 3 survivors. Lloyd Childers was informed of the demise of his squadron by his brother, reminiscing, "I was in the Naval Hospital in Pearl Harbor when my brother walked in. After our greeting, I asked him how many of our guys got picked up. Wayne just shook his head. I said incredulously, 'No one else?' He stated, 'No one else. You are the only surviving gunner from your squadron.' I laughed and I cried. It was hard to believe." While the torpedo squadrons were sacrificing themselves and keeping the Japanese fighter planes busy, the dive bomber squadrons found the Kido Butai and they began their attack. Scouting Squadron 6 from USS Enterprise followed the destroyer Arashi to the Kido Butai, that destroyer that had been left behind, to depth charge the Nautilus. The dive bomber pilots, who had been in the air more than 3 hours at this point and were low on fuel, found the Japanese ships and they began their bombing runs. Now, from start to finish, the process of dive bombing was a death-defying ride of terror. It's basically like a game of chicken that a pilot is playing with the ocean itself. The American dive bombers possessed an excellent assortment of skilled pilots. One of those was Lieutenant J.G. Dusty Cleese. a 26-year-old Naval Academy graduate from the Kansas Prairie. As Cleese explained about dive bombing, an amusement park ride by comparison was strictly a visit to Dullsville. At 20,000 feet up, an enemy vessel appears about the size of a ladybug on the tip of a shoe. When Cleese dived, he took careful aim, pointing his plane for a spot on the ocean where he expected to see his target, the Japanese carrier Kaga. He kept one eye on the bomb scope, sighting his target, but this grew difficult as the sudden rise in temperature fogged his bomb sight. Meanwhile, his other eye is watching the altimeter, which was spinning like a top. Cleese had to release his bombs between 1,500 and 1,000 feet, the bare minimum to stay above the exploding bomb fragments. So as Kaga came into his sight, Cleese jerked the bomb release lever on the left side of the cockpit. His plane gave a jolt as the bombs came loose, and he pulled back sharply on the stick, incurring about 8 G's worth of stress. His plane came so close to hitting the ocean that seawater splashed into the cockpit. Behind him, his bombs wreaked havoc on the Japanese carrier. His explosives slammed into Kaga's forward elevator, and they pierced the upper hangar, shredding planes and personnel. At 10:35, when his plane had finally reached a distance about 5 miles from the carnage, he decided to look back. He remembered, "I saw 3 carriers and huge bonfires. They were all like flaming Kansas straw stacks that were on fire." Kaga, the carrier he had mortally wounded, later sank, along with over 800 of her crew. Altogether, 48 dive bombers went into the fray that morning, and they savaged 3 Japanese carriers. But they paid a high price for their heroics. 37% never returned, running out of fuel before reaching their carriers. During this 5-minute attack, the American dive bombers sank 3 of the 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, but the Hiryu was still out there and very dangerous. During the early afternoon hours, Hiryu sent 2 airstrikes against USS Yorktown, eventually damaging the carrier enough that the crew abandoned ship on the afternoon of June 4th. Dan Caseberg was a yeoman on USS Yorktown, and he remembered the scene on the flight deck after Hiryu's planes attacked. He said, "Fire hoses were in shreds. Shrapnel had scattered all over. How the bombs missed me, I'll never know. One thing I do remember quite vividly was having a very one-sided conversation with the man in the sky. Lucky, lucky me. Very little has ever worried me since then." 2 hours later, when the torpedo attack on Yorktown occurred, Caseberg was inside the ship. He recalled, "Not having anywhere else to go, I proceeded somewhere into officers' country and found myself in the wardroom starboard side, when the almost simultaneous explosion and instantaneous listing from starboard to port caused me to slide from one side of the room to the other. Once again, all power and lights were off. The odor of exploded gunpowder, death, and destruction were stifling. I could see bodies stacked like firewood. The heavy list to port made it very difficult to walk." At 14:55, Yorktown's captain ordered abandon ship, and Caseberg and over 2,000 other men made the difficult transfer to an escort destroyer. And he remembered climbing down the slippery ropes and dropping into the cold water. Then, once he was floating in the surf, Caseberg remembered, "I made dog paddling history at full paddle towards one of those destroyers. It seemed forever, and then there I was, only 20 or 30 yards from a safe haven." Caseberg swam to that ship just as exhaustion was setting in. He warmed and rested himself, thankful to be alive. While the drama on USS Yorktown played out, the air groups on the other 2 American flat tops fashioned a plan to use the remaining daylight to find and sink the Hiryu. At 15:30, 26 dive bombers took off from the deck of USS Enterprise. The pilots reached Hiryu in less than 2 hours, positioning their planes to dive out of the sun. The American dive bombers placed 4 bombs into Hiryu in quick succession, turning the 4th Japanese carrier into a smoking wreck. 3 more dive bomber crews perished, shot down by enemy fighters. All of the surviving American pilots made it back to Enterprise before dark. Lieutenant Earl Gallagher commanded that afternoon's strike. Not only had he done most of the planning for it, but he also made an incredible gesture of generosity that his pilots remembered in the aftermath. During the battle, as he plummeted downward from 19,000 feet, he aimed his bombs perfectly. But suddenly, the enemy carrier made a radical turn to port. Knowing that his bomb would miss if he didn't make some kind of a corresponding maneuver, Gallagher tried to throw his bomb by jerking the stick at the moment of release. When his bomb jolted loose, it sent a terrible shudder through the plane that badly wrenched his back. His bomb missed anyway, and for another hour and a half, he endured blinding agony as he flew back to his carrier. At 18:15, he and the surviving aircraft arrived back at Enterprise. He signaled to his pilots that they should land ahead of him. His painful back injury kept him from being able to reach the lever that lowered his plane's tail hook. With daylight rapidly fading, he didn't want to crash on the deck, fouling it before his pilots could reach safety. For a few agonizing minutes, it appeared that Gallagher might have to ditch his plane in the ocean. But if he did, would he have the strength to crawl out before it sank? In the gathering darkness, could an escort destroyer recover him and his gunner in time? Somehow, at the last moment, he managed to ignore the pain. He reached down and pulled the lever. Then his plane touched down on the deck, the last pilot to return to the ship. The carrier's corpsman had to lift Gallagher out of the cockpit. His injury just left him too stricken to move. Like any good leader, Gallagher put the safety of his men ahead of his own. Over the next 2 days, Enterprise and Hornet launched a half-dozen other air operations, one of which ended with the sinking of a Japanese cruiser, the Mikuma. Altogether, over 3,000 Japanese sailors and aviators died during those 3 days, and thousands more were wounded. American losses amounted to 307 killed, a mix of Marines killed on the island of Midway, aviators shot down, and sailors killed during the sinking of USS Yorktown. However, a hefty number of losses weren't immediately known, as many hoped that the aviators who were listed as missing at sea might be recovered. The next few days involved an intense search for the Navy's missing aviators. 33 planes ditched during the return from the morning attack. The worst casualties were among the victorious dive bombers, 21 of whom failed to return. One of the lucky pilots was Lieutenant Clarence Dickinson of Scouting Squadron 6 from Enterprise. Weaving through anti-aircraft fire, Dickinson managed to fly his plane clear of the engagement, only to run out of fuel 20 miles short of his own fleet. He ditched his plane in the water, causing him some minor facial injuries, but he and his gunner managed to jump into a life raft. A destroyer found the 2 men, and for the remainder of the battle, they sat in the captain's quarters awaiting a transfer back to their carrier. While on the destroyer, Dickinson boasted how he had helped sink the Kaga that morning. So as a gift, the captain gave him a little identification model of the ship he had just sunk, telling him that the Navy no longer needed that one. So on June 6th, as Dickinson was transferred back to his carrier, he presented a ludicrous appearance. As he later wrote, "As I went to my carrier, I was like a kid returning from a party, holding high out of harm's way a toy. What I had, of course, was my trophy, that model of the Kaga." Other lost-at-sea stories were less fortunate. On June 4th, the TBD Devastator, flown by machinist Albert Winchell, ditched in the empty Pacific, miles away from either fleet. As their torpedo bomber sank, Winchell and his radioman gunner, Douglas Cossett, inflated their 8-foot life raft, taking with them first aid kits, 4 cans of meat, 2 packages of malted milk, and both parachutes. The next days passed in sheer agony. A blazing sun burned their skins. They grew weary due to lack of food and water. The occasional shark scared them half to death. Later on, they took to drinking rainwater, They even killed an albatross and ate it raw. Intermittently, a U.S. plane appeared on the horizon, but it always failed to spot them, at which point Winchell shook his fist in disgust. On day 12, a Japanese submarine surfaced 30 yards from the raft, and the enemy sailors unmasked their guns. For a few tense minutes, the aviators believed that the Japanese intended to shoot them. Instead, the submarine sailed off, leaving the ocean to kill the men. Then, on June 21st, 17 days after their plane went down, a speck appeared in the sky. It was an American PBY Catalina, a flying boat. The pilot spotted their life raft and landed, rescuing the two men and taking them back to Midway Island, which at that point, 17 days later, was about 360 miles away. Somehow, they had survived the sheer hell of being alone in the middle of the Pacific. However, Cosset and Winchell were lucky. 22 aviators who ditched at sea were never seen again. Easily the most controversial of the American deaths were the 3 naval aviators captured, interrogated, and executed by Japanese sailors on 2 destroyers. The day after the battle, the sailors on Arashi interrogated Ensign Wesley Osmus, a pilot from Torpedo Squadron 3. Then they partially decapitated him with a fire axe and heaved his body over the fan table. Then on June 15th, sailors on the Maki Gumo interrogated aviation machinist mate First Class Bruno Guido and his pilot, Ensign Franco Flaherty, both from Scouting Squadron 6. They tied weights to their feet and tossed the men overboard. According to Japanese records, the one thing they noted as they sent these young men to the briny depths of the Pacific was the bravery they displayed as they prepared to meet their maker. Even as their darkest hour came upon them, O'Flaherty and Guido found inner strength in exiting this world side by side. For the American pilots, it was a tough victory to stomach, although they realized what an incredible triumph they'd achieved. The loss of their friends made it bittersweet. One of those who took the battle's cost terribly hard was Lieutenant Earl Gallagher, the commanding officer of Scouting 6. After the battle, Gallagher counted the loss of 12 pilots and gunners, about a third of his squadron. In particular, he mourned his flight officer, Lieutenant Charles Ware, who never returned from the morning mission. No one ever found a trace of Ware or his gunner, and Gallagher presumed that they were shot down or ran out of fuel. When he returned to the States, Gallagher set about writing to the families. As he remembered, 50 years later, in 1992, it was very difficult for me to write letters to the families of the people who were lost. That is a hard thing to do. It was difficult to write and tell them that their son was lost in battle. It was the one thing I hated more than anything else. When I went down to Pensacola later, one lady came to see me, Charlie Ware's girlfriend. It was years later, and she still wouldn't believe it. She still wouldn't believe that he was gone. It was awfully hard to talk to people like that. Gallagher knew firsthand what risks and sacrifices it took to win the battle. And like many survivors, he made sure that people remembered. When historian Walter Lord commenced his Midway research in the 1960s, Gallagher eagerly participated, sending Lord all of the material he had accumulated about his squadron's participation, so that the first historian to write about the battle would get it right. In many ways, Lord understood the theme that the veterans conveyed to him, that everyone's role in this battle, no matter how small, offered a key piece of the total victory. Today, the memorial to the Battle of Midway at the Naval Academy, also on Midway Island, fittingly contains a quote by Lord that I think is worth considering. He wrote, "They had no right to win, yet they did. And in doing so, they changed the course of a war. More than that, they added a new name, Midway, to that small list that inspires men by example. Like Marathon, the Armada, the Marne, even against the greatest odds, There is something in the human spirit, a magic blend of skill, faith, and valor that can lift men from certain defeat to incredible victory. Indeed, that is what we must do on this anniversary. We must remember the risks, the suffering, the sacrifice made by the U.S. sailors who fought the Battle of Midway. Whether they stood at the top of the command chain or performed ordinary duties like Yeoman Dan Caseberg, we should remember them. Whether they burned alive like Lieutenant Commander Lance Massey or were lost at sea for 17 days like Winchell and Cossett, we should remember them. Whether they sank a ship like Lieutenant J.G. Dusty Cleese or sank nothing at all like Lieutenant Commander William Brockman, we should remember them. Whether they lived on into old age like Earl Gallagher or died young like Charlie Ware, we should remember them. A couple of years ago, a surviving dive bomber pilot told me this. He said, "It would take thousands of words to describe those many brave souls who gave everything for our wonderful country. At age 96, I wonder why the good Lord has spared me. He'd given me everything in this world that anyone could wish for. Considerable physical strength and endurance, the best aviation instructors, and the best rear seat gunner. Maybe it's because I can't help but write down daily events in my diary. Also, I can tell relatives of those families who'd lost true heroes about their accomplishments. Will all of our present generations follow their unexcelled patriotic deeds? On this anniversary, let us strive to meet his challenge and honor those who fought and fell in that epic naval battle 79 years ago. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Mrs. Orr. That was outstanding. Ladies and gentlemen, please rise. Admiral Grady and Fleet Master Chief O'Rourke will now place a commemorative wreath. Our wreath-laying ceremony here at Fleet Forces Command serves as our tangible remembrance, along with many similar wreath-laying ceremonies throughout the U.S. Navy this week. As the Fleet Master Chief lays this wreath, know that wreaths will be laid around the globe in honor of our Midway veterans. We pause to remember and honor the spirit of Midway in our Navy and our nation. We pause to honor all those who have served, are serving, with honor, courage, and commitment. Staff at ease. This concludes our ceremony. Please join Mrs. Orr for an insightful question and answer period honoring our war-fighting heritage immediately following the ceremony. Additionally, the ceremonial displays will remain throughout the morning for your viewing. Thank you.